Shalom Aleichem. We are learning the Sicha of Korach Aleph, which is made up of Sichas that were said in two different years, Tafshin Lamed Gimel and Tafshin Lamed Daled, 1973 and 1974, where the Rebbe really delves into exploring the sin of Korach from a positive perspective. And it's actually quite fascinating how the combination goes. These sichas, by the way, are the ones that are currently being translated by Lahak and being reworked in Teres Menachem. Lamed Gimel was done last year, Lamed Daled is done this year. So it's interesting. Whenever, it's sichas earlier than Lamed Gimel, Lamed Daled, I just open my Teres Menachem and I could just learn it from there. But often some sichas in Lamed Daled, etc., I have to go to Google Sichas Kodesh. And then you're finding like the original typeset and you're trying to make sense. But in general, when you find the sichas, it often adds an incredible amount of richness. I'll give you a small example. In the Sicha, in Ois Vav, he speaks about the fact that we were all by Sinai, we were all Mamleches Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, and therefore we are able to, they had the desire to have the kingship, to have the kahuna. I didn't see it, maybe it's already inside the Sicha, but I only saw it when I went through the original, the way the Rebbe said it. He says, now we can understand how a Kohen Gadol could be mitzi all the Yidden through his Avodah. It's not understood. How can a Kohen Gadol be mitzi all the Yidden? It's a steer to the klal, that whatever you can't do yourself, you can't make a shliach. And Yidden are not able to do kuna gedela. They're not kohen gedela. So how could the kohen gadol be mitzi them? And the Rebbe explains it based on what we say over here. Bibald Yidden seine gewen b'shas matan Torah their dager from mamleches kohenim. They were the level of mamleches kohenim. Nor speter, only after Chet Egel that it was given to Aaron Avanav. Therefore, the Kohen Gadol could be mitzi them, just like we find by the Levi, and we saw in last week's parsha, the Sunnim, Heima Tachas Bnei Yisrael, that they're instead of us, they replace us, but ultimately they're doing it on our behalf. So Lefizia Kumtois says, Yidden saying, we were a Kohen Gadol by Kuna Gdela, and we just had a Yedida. Which is one interesting point that the Rebbe talks about. Another interesting point that the Rebbe spoke about in Tafshin Lamed Gimel is that in general, the Sedra of Korach has a for all Yidden, even a Pashat Sheba Pshatim, even to somebody who doesn't know what they're saying, because you can make the Birchas HaTorah and Torah Shebechsav even if you don't know it. So it must mean that the Haidah has a Shaykhus, everything in Korach has a Shaykhus with us, and that's how the Rebbe goes into the whole idea that Afani Reitze Bekach, I also want this. I also want the Kahuna Gedela, which is one aspect which I found quite interesting. Another interesting thing within the Sicha itself, look at the Sichas, is in Chelik Ches, in Ois Ches, you'll see there's a lot of footnotes. Then on the footnotes, there's Shuli Hagilian, which are footnotes on footnotes. And then very unusual, it's not that often, look at the Sichas, you have a Shuli Hagilian, you have a comment on. So it's like 4 different fonts on one page, on the page of Ois Ches. And what's the Rebbe really exploring there? The Rebbe is exploring a fundamental question, which is beyond the scope of this year. And I'll be honest, I myself am really struggling to get it. You obviously have to go deep into the sources, but the Rebbe is going into the idea of Gilgulim, based on the Igeris HaKodesh. If you look in the 55th footnote, number 55, Igeris HaKodesh Reish Simon Chav Tes quotes the Arizal, who says, "Shekol Adam Yisrael tzarich love big Gilgulim rabim." Each person has to come through many Gilgulim until they keep all the Tayag Mitzvah Torah, b'machshava, dibur, u'maisa. And this basically explains the idea that we were talking about, that every person has to have the aspiration to go to all the mitzvahs, the avodah ruchnis of Kohen Gadol. And the Rebbe over there quotes that the Arizal says, "Levad mitzvahs hatluyus b'melech." Besides the mitzvahs that are tali b'melech, because he's mitzi kol Yisrael, but it doesn't mention kahuna gedolah. But he says in Likutei Torah Yom Kippur, it says that specifically a person has to keep all the mitzvahs, afilu mitzvahs koyanim v'koyen gadol. Whatever, then they're finding a difference between the way it says it in the Sefer Gedolim over here, but ultimately the idea that a person's supposed to have each and every mitzvah going through them. And this leads to an incredible amount of footnotes where the Rebbe really starts exploring the idea of Gilgul Ibur, the mitzvahs malach. You don't need Ibur, but other mitzvahs you do need, even mitzvahs koyanim gdolim, kohen gadol, you need through Ibur or through Gilgul, and the difference between how a melech affects us when they do a mitzvah on our behalf to the way a kohen gadol affects us. It is very involved and quite fascinating. Another point to really, delve deeply is the Hira, the Ois Tes, Ois Yud, the three different levels of of serving Hashem, and specifically the idea that Mesiras Nefesh is a level that most of us cannot sit there. It's not a standard avodah for each and every one of us. Which, again, obviously a person has to live in Mesiras Nefesh, but it's not a standard. Part of the Sicha is based on Tafshin Lamed Gimel, but there's one part that's based on Tafshin Lamed Daled, and that's really in the questions. In nice space, the Rebbe went and explored in question number 3, the Bachlalos Machlekes Korach. We have to understand Hashem promised V'gam b'cha ya'aminu la'olam. So how is it possible that Korach should be able to fight with Moshe Rabbeinu? So originally, this was like a Sicha that stood on itself, and the Rebbe explained that just like Rashi explains in Parshas Vayishlach, that Yaakov says, "V'ata amarta eitiv eitiv imach," and why does Yaakov have to daven if Hashem promised? And he said because he thought Shema Gadol Machet. So too by Moshe Rabbeinu, he thought Shema Gadol Machet, the sin maybe weakened his promise V'gam b'cha ya'aminu la'olam, because the fact is they're arguing with him, so they don't believe him. At some stage during the Sicha, the Rebbe pointed to somebody that obviously was like, sitting like chilled out. And the Rebbe says you could sit barachava, but not here, not bedabim. Interesting that it just makes it into the Sichas Kodesh. And therefore Moshe said, "B'zois tedin shad Hashem shlachani," because he thought that Korach doesn't believe in him, even though there's Avtach v'gam b'cha ya'aminu la'olam, but Shema Gadol Machet. So therefore, he had to prove that Hashem it was the one that sent him, which is, again, a standalone part of our Sicha. And when the Rebbe was talking about this, he said in the original Sicha about Emunas Tzadikim. The Rebbe said, we're talking about v'gam b'cha ya'aminu la'olam, which is talking about each and every Yid, that everyone believes in Moshe Rabbeinu. Begili, it's not seen. You just have to remove the cover and Helem, and then you see how every Yid believes. And when the Emunah is Begilui, this impacts everything that they will do. Al Pi Emunah, and that's the meaning of the Emunah, that you should shepherd Emunah, that you have to bring the Emunah, which is hidden by Yidden, and reveal it and bring it into life, into the way we live. And Chasar Siyam, they were lacking the final words the Rebbe said about that. But ultimately, this nugget of the Sicha, this part of the Sicha, becomes a topic of Emunas Tzadikim, which is an interesting, again, a standalone idea that we can take from the Sicha, the idea of V'gam b'cha ya'aminu la'olam.